In the summer of 2018, I rode a Honda Africa Twin motorcycle from the Mexican border in Big Bend National Park to the Arctic Ocean in Alaska. This video is about the final leg of the journey, which stretches from north of Fairbanks to Prudhoe Bay. Specifically, it's about the 4 days I spent on what is famously known as the Dalton Highway. To understand the Dalton Highway, you have to know a little bit about the history of oil exploration in Alaska. Oil was first discovered in the Arctic part of Alaska in 1968. In order to transport the oil south, the Trans-Alaska Pipeline was built between 1974 and 1977, and it stretches about 800 miles from Prudhoe Bay at the north all the way to Valdez at the south. Once the oil arrives in Valdez, it's loaded onto large tankers, and from there it's shipped to its final destinations for refining. In order to build a pipeline and bring supplies and machinery to the oil fields of Prudhoe Bay, a road system had to be constructed. This was originally known as the haul road because it was mostly heavy rigs and 18-wheelers hauling equipment up to the oil field. In 1981, the name was changed from the Haul Road to the Dalton Highway, which is named after James William Dalton, who was an engineer and involved with early oil exploration in the Arctic. And then, beginning in 1994, the Dalton Highway was open to the public. To this day, the main purpose of the Dalton Highway is still to service the oil fields, and so there's a lot of trucks that are still going up and down the road every single day. You hear a lot about the dangers of riding a motorcycle on the Dalton Highway due to the fact that there's so much heavy truck traffic, but what I found was that the drivers were actually very professional and always kind of made sure to give you plenty of room, and as long as you slowed down and respected them, they tended to be courteous and respect you back. It was actually more the passenger vehicles that you had to be careful for. Seems like some of those guys didn't pay as much attention and realize that you're a little bit more exposed on a bike. The landscape on the first couple hundred miles of the Dalton Highway is boreal forest, which is mostly made up of different types of fir, spruce, some aspen trees, and just gently rolling hills type of terrain. And the highway itself is mostly paved on the first half, which goes up to Coldfoot, although there's maybe 30% or so that's dirt track still. Here I'm crossing the Yukon River, and you can see the pipeline is never too far away from the road. The Yukon is a pretty impressive river, and this is a big bridge that's all got a wood floor on it, and so you've got to watch yourself on there if it's slippery and raining. At one point, I pulled over just to look at the landscape and take some pictures, and a few minutes later, another motorcycle pulled over, and it was a guy riding a KTM. His name was Frankie. He's from Hong Kong, and about 4 or 5 years ago, he'd ridden a KLR from San Francisco all the way down to Terra del Fuego in Argentina. And then this time, he'd borrowed a friend's bike in Reno, and he was riding it all the way up to Prudhoe Bay. Frankie and I kind of hit it off and started having a good time, so we decided to ride together, and we spent really the next 3 days all the way up to Prudhoe Bay and then back to Fairbanks together, and that was a lot of fun, and it's nice having somebody else there on a road like this just in case something does happen. You can help each other out. Pretty close to Coldfoot, probably another 10 or 15 miles to go. Hopefully not much longer because my fuel's getting pretty low. But it's just been a pretty spectacular drive. A lot of this section of the road is paved, and so it's actually not too bad riding. There was some moisture the last few days, but it's not too muddy. It's pretty bearable, pretty easy riding, pretty fun. So yeah, tomorrow I'll camp in Wiseman tonight, and then tomorrow I'll tackle this section from Wiseman up to Dead Horse, and hopefully it doesn't rain too much overnight. Before we knew it, we'd arrived at the Arctic Circle, and you know you're crossing into the Arctic Circle because there's actually a sign right on the side of the road there. So from here on out, we weren't really going to be having any darkness at night, and so we just stopped there for a few minutes just to take it all in and enjoy the moment. About halfway up the Dalton Highway, there's a wide spot in the road called Coldfoot Camp, and this is really the only place where you can refuel between Fairbanks up to Prudhoe Bay. And it's about 250 miles before Prudhoe Bay, so you have to have enough fuel to go that far, which in a vehicle is not a big deal, but on a motorcycle, especially if the conditions are bad, that can be cutting it close, so you want to often pack a little bit of extra fuel. They also have a little restaurant and motel here, and that's about the extent of the services. There's a campground a few miles away also where one can park or set up a tent. While we were here, we also met another gentleman from China. His name was Han, and he was actually going from Fairbanks all the way to the Arctic Ocean on a bicycle, which is definitely a feat. And he'd broken down, and so he was waiting for a couple parts to come in. So we chatted with him for a little while and adjusted a few things on Frankie's bike before we hit the road again. But you definitely meet all kinds of people on the Dalton Highway, and that's one of the things that I enjoyed about it is there's a lot of diversity. There's truck drivers that are trying to make a living. You've got hunters, tourists, adventures, and so it's a nice mix, and everybody's got an interesting story, and we'll introduce some more of them in the rest of the video. About 10 or 12 miles up the road from Coldfoot, there's a little settlement called Wiseman right along the river there, and Frankie had rented a cabin for the night. There's several places where you can rent those, and they're really nice rustic cabins. So he was going to stay there, and we went over there for a cup of coffee, and then I actually just set up my tent right on the banks of the river. This is going to be the last morning here. I'm camped out over by Wiseman. You can see I'm right on the river. I just kind of camped on this gravel bar. Got a little bit chilly last night, not too bad, maybe about 38 degrees. So I'm bundled up a little bit this morning. The ride might be a little cold. I heard there's some places where there's snow it snowed a little bit yesterday, and the Dalton Highway is supposed to be a little bit muddy, so we'll see how that goes. Last night, of course, I'm pretty far north of the Arctic Circle, so it never really got dark, but I still got a good night's sleep, so that was no problem. It's cold enough. I think the mosquitoes aren't really a problem, so yeah, it'll be looking forward to getting up to the Arctic Ocean hopefully tonight.
step back to see the truth around you. From a distance you can tell. You and me were meant to be in the great outdoors, forever free. You and me, meant to be in the great outdoors.
Arriving into Dead Horse is a little bit anticlimactic just because it's not like any town or city you've ever experienced. It's important to remember that Dead Horse is just really an oil field service town, and so there's not really any businesses like you would expect. It's just contractors and parts and machinery and equipment that are used for the Prudhoe Bay oil fields. And architecture is a little bit interesting. It's everything up here is on permafrost, and so if you'll notice, a lot of the buildings are actually up on stilts so that cold air can circulate between the building and the ground, because otherwise what would happen is if the buildings are built right on top of the permafrost and they don't have a ventilation system underneath, what'll happen is the ground will get warm and it will thaw out, and eventually the building would end up just sinking into the mud. So they have to deal with some pretty unique elements up here in terms of the weather. Another interesting person I met on this trip was this young lady here. Her name is Sophie, and in the past she had ridden her bicycle along the pipeline all the way from Fairbanks to Valdez, and this year she decided to ride solo from Fairbanks all the way up to the Arctic Ocean, which on a motorcycle is not that bad, but on a bicycle, this is a really muddy, tough road and just harsh conditions. So anybody out there that thinks they're tough, if you come up here and you meet people like Sophie, you'll definitely rethink that a little bit. After a good night's rest in Wiseman, we hit the road and headed into Fairbanks, which is about 250 or so miles. And once we got there, it's important to wash off the bike because they use calcium chloride on the Dalton Highway to kind of hold the road together. But that's very abrasive and corrosive on pretty much any equipment. And it's nearly impossible actually to get completely off. So we spent a good little while just trying to clean everything off so that the bikes wouldn't suffer any long-term damage.